working for you. This is the 23 News Update at 10.
Inspiring kids and adults of all backgrounds by spreading positivity and putting an end to hate and intolerance. A first of its kind traveling museum experience heads to the state line.
23 News reporter Jake Pearson travels to Byron High School, where the Mobile Museum of Tolerance makes a pit stop, teaching students and visitors how to speak up when they witness acts of bullying or racism.
The Mobile Museum of Tolerance first opened in 2021, traveling around Illinois to schools and libraries. To date, more than 18,000 people have visited the bus.
Most of the time, it's me and our driver traveling to different regions of the state.
Wheels, headlights, and rearview mirrors aren't something you might find outside of a typical museum, which is why this traveling mobile education center is the first of its kind.
Our goal is to not just teach people about history, but really get people to talk about what's going on in our world today.
The Mobile Museum of Tolerance travels around the Prairie State, spreading awareness about racism, bullying, and hate. Wednesday, the bus parked itself at Byron High School, where students were taken onto the bus to participate in interactive activities.
I think there were some great conversations between kids, and some of them became aware of some things they weren't. It's a big picture out there, and we have to do what we can to educate our kids and help them be safe.
Inside the bus, inspirational quotes from historical figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi line the walls, and TV screens play educational workshops about the civil rights movement and the story of Anne Frank.
Then Jews, instead of being doomed, will be held up as an example.
It was one of the very first communities that we visited. We were teaching a lesson about Anne Frank. There was a kid who raised their hand and said, "What is a Jewish person?" He had never met a Jewish person. We can open up the door for that conversation and get people to think about strategies and actions they can take to make a difference in their own world.
The Mobile Museum of Tolerance is an extension of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a Jewish human rights activist organization with a mission to end anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Jake. And while the Mobile Museum is the first of its kind in the U.S., a Canadian version called Tour for Humanity was launched in 2013. The bus was booked so much, a second bus was actually ordered in 2022.